And we were never so well off that we could do it without the NHS, without the local school, without a host of public services. And so to those who say our offer to Britain's mainstream middle is more about votes than values, I say that completely misunderstands what New Labour has always been about, and I have always been about.
I think I can smell shite. Yes, I can definitely smell shite.
And welcome to this Politics Now special. 30 years ago, Margaret Thatcher became Britain's first woman Prime Minister. For 11.5 years, she redefined first among equals. Not since Churchill was a government so utterly conditioned by the personality of the Premier. In Scotland, her politics were to prove explosive. An agenda of curbing trade union power, liberalising markets, ending a culture of subsidy, and of course resisting Home Rule demands would galvanise her opponents. She became the bête noire of the left. But curiously, she also seemed to rile those who had little or no politics. To paraphrase an Aaron Bevan, there were a lot of emotional spasms in the opposition to her. Much of it seemed irrational, much of it sexist, all of it hurled with a vitriol not seen in post-war Scotland. This programme will examine her politics and legacy. It takes the form of a debate I chaired in the Signet Library in Edinburgh. Proposing the motion, Sir Malcolm Rifkind MP. He held ministerial office every day of her premiership, including, of course, the post of Scottish Secretary. He was assisted by the former Scots Tory leader, David McLetchie MSP. In the red corner, the former Labour Minister Brian Wilson and the ex-SNP Deputy Leader Jim Sillars. Those two were on opposite sides of many issues in the 70s and 80s, but for one night only, united in their belief that Mrs. Thatcher was a disaster for Scotland.
It's my very great pleasure now to invite Sir Malcolm Rifkind MP to move the motion for debate. Margaret Thatcher did more good than harm in Scotland. Sir Malcolm.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I have come to praise Margaret Thatcher, not to bury her. I am extremely conscious of the fact that time is very tight this evening, so I will follow the very good advice of King Henry VIII, who said to each of his 6 wives, "Please don't worry, I don't intend to keep you long." I'm also delighted to be speaking against Brian Wilson and Jim Sillars. Brian, of course, and I were both former ministers, and when you retire as a minister, it's quite traumatic. I think the best definition I heard of what retirement means for a minister is when you climb into the back of your car and it doesn't go anywhere. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to start by reminding you of the motion for a very good reason. The motion is that Margaret Thatcher did more good than harm in Scotland. Now, just consider what that motion doesn't say. This is not about whether Margaret Thatcher was a popular Prime Minister, whether people liked her very much. She may not have been the sort of person you'd have wanted to go on holiday with, but I could say the same about at least one other Prime Minister who you can ponder about. So the question is not her popularity. There are many people who dislike Margaret Thatcher south of the border, but who voted for her, as did many in Scotland, because they felt that she was the best person to serve the interests of the country. Nor is it about whether all that she did was right and whether she never made a mistake. The motion is that she did more good than harm in Scotland. And that's a very important point, because any great Prime Minister has had a very mixed record. Winston Churchill was responsible for Gallipoli. He was accused of bringing the army in to the Tonypandy miners, but no one doubts that he was a great Prime Minister and that the net effect of his leadership was beneficial. The same goes for Charles de Gaulle, the same goes for many of the great world leaders. And I would argue this evening that overwhelmingly the same goes for Margaret Thatcher in Scotland as well as elsewhere in the United Kingdom. Of course there were great mistakes. The poll tax was a great political mistake. But you know, it actually didn't do that much harm to Scotland. The harm it did was to Margaret Thatcher and to the Conservative Party. Scotland survived the poll tax, as we all well know. But let us look at the actual positive record. What is it that Margaret Thatcher can claim to be remembered for that has a particular Scottish dimension and which I think would be acknowledged by any fair-minded person? Let me briefly remind you. First of all, housing. You know, when I first became a Scottish Office Minister in 1979, Scotland had less home ownership, not just in any other part of the United Kingdom, but than most of Europe, including some of communist Europe. Probably everyone here, or most people here, own their own homes, or could do so if they wished. But there had been an assumption for many years that home ownership in Scotland was for the middle classes. And if you weren't middle class, you could only aspire to rented accommodation. Margaret Thatcher assured people that they could have their choice. And the Scots responded as enthusiastically as south of the border to the opportunities for home ownership. And that is something which could not have happened but for her initiative. So there was a revolution in home ownership, perhaps not perfect. I know mistakes were made in housing as they were elsewhere. But we now have a level of home ownership that corresponds to the aspirations of the vast majority of Scots. Think of education. Think of state education, where until Thatcher's day, not only did we not have school governors or school councils, not only did we not have parental choice, there was no way parents in the state sector in education in Scotland could have any influence on the way their schools were run, that their children attended, or the actual school that their child was required to go to. Think of the trade union situation. The problems of trade union militancy, of violent picketing, it was just as acute north as south of the border. The vast majority of Scots were very satisfied indeed that the trade unions should operate under the law, equal under the law, but not privileged under the law. Think of the economy, and you will say, yes, but what about the economy? Large numbers of people unemployed. What about Ravenscraig, you might say? Worth remembering, Ravenscraig remained open right through Prime Minister Thatcher's reign in power. What we saw was major changes to our economy, but we also saw that these changes were necessary. Who today seriously doubts that even if the mining sector or the shipbuilding sector or the steel sector had not declined under the Thatcher government, that they would not have declined in the years thereafter? And so if something is unfortunately necessary, perhaps the way that she went about it angered or upset or annoyed many people, but it helped Scotland prepare for a new phase in our economic life, and one that was of enormous importance. And of course, Scots are not just parochial, they're part of a larger situation, a larger country. And we know that Thatcher, through her relationship with Reagan and with Gorbachev, made a huge contribution to the ending of the Cold War. You will say, well, some of Scottish icons suffered. Yes, some probably did. But the Black Watch, the Royal Scots, the Argylls didn't disappear under Thatcher, they disappeared under Gordon Brown. The Bank of Scotland and the Royal Bank of Scotland didn't go into virtual bankruptcy under Margaret Thatcher. That happened more recently, as we can recollect. These are important points. And those who criticise the so-called Sermon on the Mount might actually like to read it first. And they will find a speech that may have been controversial, but no more controversial than many of the speeches that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown have made about the welfare requirements of our country and the need to ensure personal responsibility. So Margaret Thatcher was an intensely controversial person. I don't doubt that for a moment. Francois Mitterrand said she had the eyes of Caligula and the lips of Marilyn Monroe. Dennis Healey once described her as Attila the Hen. It was characteristic of Margaret Thatcher that she received both comments as a compliment, not as a criticism. But I finish my remarks by simply saying this. You know, already the process of historical judgment has gone quite a considerable way. Tony Blair tried to suggest he was the true heir of Margaret Thatcher. Gordon Brown invited her to tea in 10 Downing Street, the most extraordinary event in her life, and only to be compared with the other Maggie who had tea with Mussolini some years earlier. So, ladies and gentlemen, I simply ask you this evening not to find that she was a saint, not to find that she was uncontroversial, not to find that some things she did in Scotland didn't damage Scotland, but to recognise that the net judgment was beneficial to the whole of the United Kingdom. If you are fair-minded, you will judge with your head, not with your heart. And you will judge that, like all great prime ministers, she had the single-minded determination not only to do what was necessary at that time, but in also to ensure that future generations would have a fuller and more satisfying life. And I think against that test, she can deserve to be vindicated. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Sir Malcolm. And now to put the opposing view, Brian Wilson.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman, and congratulations to those who have organised this debate tonight. It's very obvious there's a big market in Scotland for intelligent debate, which probably explains why there's a couple of MSPs in the audience, but the creme de la creme. It was a great pleasure to follow Malcolm Rifkind and to welcome him back from Thatcherite exile in Kensington and Chelsea, one of the few recorded successes for a year of homecoming. But when I heard the very warm applause that greeted Malcolm's speech, it reminded me of two things. One, that I'm in Edinburgh, and the second, it reminded me of an incident that one of my few encounters with the lady in question not long after I became an MP. And she'd been on a visit to Paris, and there was great controversy over the claim that the Parisians had booed her. And Margaret Thatcher stood at the dispatch box and she said, "This is absolute nonsense." She said, 90% were cheering. And I just happened to get a question at that point. I said, "But do you not realise that the 90% who were cheering the 10% who were booing?" So let's hope it's the same. Let's hope it's the same tonight. But where better to have a debate about the Thatcher legacy than here in Edinburgh, in the city of Sir Fred and Sir George and Sir Peter and Sir... because these noble guardians of the Thatcherite tradition, the four watchwords of Thatcherism: greed, deregulation, brass neck and more greed. But the book and to David Torrens' very good book, and I congratulate him on it and congratulate the excellent Berlin on publishing it. But it is good to review the past. I'm very much in favour of that. But reviewing history should not become synonymous with revising history, because it's very tempting at the range of 2 decades or 3 decades to soften, to think, well, maybe it wasn't so bad, maybe there was a case for it, to go through a checklist and this policy might have been right or this one might not have been so wrong. But what I would ask you to do tonight is to go with your instincts and your memories, and consider the possibility that what you felt at the time was actually the truth about Thatcher and Thatcherism. And think of these ravaged communities. Think of these industries that were destroyed needlessly. Think of these thousands of people who were thrown in the scrap heap in pursuit of some economic theory. And that was the reality of Thatcherism. And on this side, we don't have to be selective in our memories. We can grant a lot of what Malcolm has said. We can say, yes, there were policies which were necessary or were justified or which have changed Scotland or changed Britain for the better. But at the end of the day, we come back to the bigger argument that they were greatly outweighed by the negatives and the way in which these negatives were accomplished. And I certainly, for one, I have never made the foolish mistake of separating the social and the economic sides of Thatcherism. They were one and the same, and what the economic policies did created the social consequences. A generation of damage and a generation of lost opportunity for so many people. But Thatcher wasn't just about the policies. It wasn't just about taking on the miners. It wasn't just about the poll tax. It wasn't just about any of these isolated examples. Thatcherism was and is, it should be seen through the prism of the ism of Thatcherism, because it was a philosophy, and the whole was bigger than the sum of the parts. It was about the promotion of individual greed, individual vaunting ambition over any concept of community or social cohesion, which he dismissed with utter contempt. Thatcher gave rise to Thatcherism, and the lady should be judged through the prism of that ism. Hers was a creed that very specifically dismissed society. But there was always a political rationale to it. There was a cynicism to it. It wasn't out of belief. It was out of an understanding politically that as long as 40% of the population were doing well, then the other 60 could be forgotten about. And within that other 60, perhaps most perniciously of all, that 20% were not only dispensable, but became categorised as a social underclass who were virtually marginalised from society altogether. And that became the price worth paying. And the logic of that, the logic that it led to, was particularly the policy of the poll tax, which very specifically calculated that if enough people who were winning out of this were prepared to vote for it, then the rest were utterly dispensable to the winning of elections. Now, I have never subscribed to the view, the anti-Scottish line about Thatcherism, because everything I've said tonight could be applied equally to other parts of the United Kingdom. And it was a north-south divide, because most of that 40%, but by no means all of them, lived in the southern part of the United Kingdom rather than the northern part of the United Kingdom. But the same story could have been told in the ravaged industrial north of England or in Wales, as was in Scotland, whereas, of course, in many parts of Scotland there were Tories, there are Tories, and again, I never believed in the stuff about a Tory-free zone. The Scotland I've lived in all my life is not a Tory-free zone, and it's a distortion of its representation to pretend that it ever was or ever should be. There were people in Scotland who did well out of Thatcherism and who supported Thatcherism. So that's the balance. That is a balance to be taken. Not about specific policies, but the overall impact on a generation. And when you vote tonight, or I don't know, we are going to vote tonight, but what I would ask you to remember is that Thatcher was thrown out in the end, not because she was right, but because she was wrong. And there is no case for the rehabilitation of Thatcher or Thatcherism other than misguided sentiment at the range of 2 or 3 decades. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, and a big thanks to the first 2 speakers also for sticking to time, which is marvellous because it gives more opportunity for the audience to contribute. But to second the motion now, David McCletchie, MSP.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to second the motion tonight, moved by Malcolm Rifkind. He, of course, can speak as a parliamentary colleague and member of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet during her time as a Prime Minister. I speak as a Conservative foot soldier of that era, but one who in later life, through the Scottish Parliament, has had to deal with the Thatcher legacy to Scotland. Now, last year I spoke at a conference in St Andrews on St Andrews Day. And I told my audience that St Andrew had never set foot in Scotland, had never heard of Scotland, that Scotland as Scotland did not exist when he was alive, and that his connection with Scotland was tenuous to say the least, being based on a small bag of some of his bones, which were of course holy relics, being brought to Scotland by a monk now known as St Rule. Nevertheless, he became Scotland's patron saint, which just goes to show that the less you do for this country of ours, the more you are appreciated. And that is, of course, because nobody kent his father. Now, like St Andrew, I suspect there are many, and we've just heard from one, who think that had the Blessed Margaret done less for Scotland, then she would be appreciated more in Scotland. But would we really be better off as a consequence? Well, I think not. And I want to highlight a few areas where I think Mrs Thatcher certainly did a lot more good than harm. And the first is in relation to the advancement of women in politics. Mrs Thatcher remains our first and only woman Prime Minister, and the first and only woman to lead a United Kingdom political party. In Scotland, we've actually done better than elsewhere in trying to emulate what she achieved 30 years ago, as 3 of the 4 major parties in the Scottish Parliament have or have had women parliamentary leaders, in Annabel Goldie, Nicola Sturgeon and Wendy Alexander. Now, the last 2 would probably prefer to bite their well-exercised tongues than claim inspiration from Mrs Thatcher. But nonetheless, she blazed a trail which remains unsurpassed and unmatched. And that may be galling to the political feminists of the left, but of course it remains one of these irritating ironies so much enjoyed by Conservatives. Secondly, of course, Mrs Thatcher was instrumental in establishing the moral superiority of conservatism over the ideology of socialism, illustrated, of course, during her premiership by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the break-up of the Soviet bloc. She was denounced for the so-called Sermon on the Mount, referred to earlier. But why was her reference to the parable of the Good Samaritan condemned? when now we praise wealthy men and women turned philanthropists such as Tom Hunter and Anne Gloag and Tom Farmer, and have rehabilitated Andrew Carnegie. And I would suggest it was because Mrs Thatcher was perceived as being seen to proclaim the superiority of Conservative ideas over the rather sloppy Jesus was a socialist thinking of too many in our churches, and that this attracted such venom and outrage from the Scottish chattering classes as a consequence. Mrs Thatcher was not afraid to attack the complacent and arrogant assumptions of the left that their ideas were somehow morally superior, and in so doing she laid an enduring foundation which transformed the terms of political debate to this day. An even better parable, of course, would have been the parable of the talents, where Jesus praised the wealth creators even when that wealth was not applied for such obviously philanthropic purposes as was the case with the Good Samaritan, but no doubt that would have provoked an even greater level of apoplexy. Thirdly, we need to look to the practical achievements, some of which Malcolm has listed in his opening remarks, in tackling the power of the trade unions, in establishing industrial democracy in our society, despite the best efforts of the National Union of Mine Workers, in restructuring the Scottish economy, in selling council houses, and in expanding educational opportunities. The right to buy, referred to by Malcolm, has been exercised by over 400,000 households in Scotland, and that did more to make housing affordable to working men and women in this country than any other measure enacted before or since, because it enabled people to fulfil personal aspirations which had been thwarted by years of municipal socialism. And equally as important for opportunity and the ideas and inspirations was the expansion of higher education, achieved, I remind you, without requiring our young people to pay tuition fees during or before, during, I should say, or after their period of study. Now, the case for the free enterprise economy was made by Margaret Thatcher, and even in the midst of the current financial crisis, it still commands wide acceptance across the political spectrum. Notwithstanding what has happened to our banks, we don't hear many calls for the nationalisation of the top 200 companies. Indeed, the Labour government intends to press ahead with the part privatisation of the Royal Mail, and until very recently, the SNP was contemplating the part privatisation of Scotland's forests. All of which, of course, demonstrates that Mrs Thatcher was right in many respects, and the creation of the new Labour Party was, of course, her finest achievement, because it marked the fundamental change in the terms of debate as to how society should be governed and our economy should be run. And moreover, when we consider how to cope with the current crisis, do we not need someone with our singular strength of purpose and conviction to steer us through? At the moment, there seems to be a universal acceptance that we spend our way out of the crisis to mitigate the impacts of recession. Now, responsible politicians know that the present fiscal and monetary measures will have to be counterbalanced by much tougher measures in later years to balance the books and prevent inflation once more taking a grip. However, there is a remarkable reluctance to make this too explicit, and a lot of reliance on a very sunny set of assumptions indeed about the future. One wonders if any political leader of our times will speak with the clarity, courage and conviction which the current situation demands. Well, I don't think anyone in this room would doubt for a second that Mrs Thatcher would have done so. And that is the measure of the woman. She was not afraid to shatter illusions and delusions in order to chart the right course at a time when the British economy was a basket case and our country a laughingstock on the world stage. And I would say in conclusion that if today's politicians follow her example in that respect, they will perform a signal and lasting service for Scotland and the rest of Britain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the final contribution before we go to questions is from Jim Sillars.
Mr Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, if New Labour is in fact an invention of Margaret Thatcher, then she's one hell of a lot to answer for. When I won the Govan by-election, the poll tax was a very, very important and pertinent matter. And I was always very grateful there wasn't a camera present at Govan Cross one day, because I had just finished about 60 times shouting, "I'm no going to pay Thatcher's poll tax," when a man came up to me and said, "I don't know what the hell you're talking about. She doesn't stay here." Now, we've heard both Malcolm and David telling us that one of the great achievements was the sale of council houses. Well, I beg to differ, because the consequences of that policy was that the best housing stock in Scotland was sold. What was left was the worst housing stock, and ever since then we've had councils unable to build the number of social housing that we require. And we've had an underclass locked up in the very, very worst of housing they cannot give to anyone else. So I don't believe that was an achievement at all. Then there was the enemy within. And I never was a great admirer of Arthur Scargill. But I would have thought it incumbent on any major politician, a national figure, to be able to clearly distinguish between an idiot who was a leader and the people who unfortunately fell into his grasp at that particular time. But it always struck me, and it's interesting, that in the Financial Times, which is not a socialist newspaper, they made the comment that very often you got the impression that there was a degree of almost cruelty in the way that people whose communities were being destroyed were so easily dismissed by the theory of Thatcherism. In the front piece to David's book, it says, "Thatcherism in a cold climate." Now I want to explore why Scotland was such a cold climate. And there's a quite deep reason, and it's a philosophical reason. There was a great philosophical divide between what Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph believed in and what the broad mass of the Scottish people took for their values. For Margaret Thatcher, market forces were everything. There was no such thing as society. And we've heard already references to the great Sermon on the Mount and the Good Samaritans. Well, of course, market forces, as we've just learned, aren't everything. Alistair Darling is the first Trotskyist who ever nationalised a bank and was unhappy about it. And as for no such thing as a society, I don't believe that fits into our values. Now, the Sermon on the Mount and the Good Samaritan. Malcolm and David line up with Margaret Thatcher, believing you can only be a good Samaritan if you've got wealth. That's not true. Not true at all. When my mother died when I was 3 years old and my brother 7, my father was a railwayman during the war, all hours away. The Good Samaritan for us was Mrs. Kelly in the flat underneath. She had no more wealth than an ordinary working class woman with a working class wage coming in. And how do folk think they managed in the Gorbals and the back-to-backs in Dundee when adversity struck a family well before there was a welfare state? Because people were good Samaritans to each other. You don't need wealth to be a good Samaritan. Now, I want to give you a quote in the context of my argument that our values are different, from Robert Burns, who is a poet who was read by a man who was unfortunate enough to be born 200 years before Dr. Starkey, Abraham Lincoln, who devoured Burns' poetry. This is his comment on a man seeking work. See yonder poor our laboured wight, so abject, mean and vile, who begs a brother of the earth to gie him leave to toil, and see his lordly fellow worm the poor petition spurn. Now, in the long years between those words being penned and today, there is no substantial difference in the condition of people. You have to be able to sell your labour in order to live at the level of dignity that you want and have the necessary autonomy over your own life. People in the financial services sector, lawyers and accountants in Edinburgh are discovering that truth at the present time. And it's the socialist point of view, as opposed to the Thatcherist point of view, that collective action is actually essential if we are in fact to protect the individual and give him and her the opportunity of being an individual with autonomy. The reason that it's a cold climate up here for Thatcherism is quite simple. We are different. We have different values from the ones espoused by Margaret Thatcher, and if I may say so, our values are better values. Now, I want to finish on the political legacy. Here's Malcolm, the former Governor-General of Scotland. He's one of the, and I don't want to embarrass you, Malcolm, but he's one of the most able politicians and one of the most decent people I have ever met in my life. And he'll be very surprised to hear that on the day after he was beaten at Pentlands, Margot and I were up in Safeways then, when a man came up and said, "You'll be delighted that Malcolm Rifkin got gubbed." And he got gubbed in return by Margot and me because we didn't want Malcolm Rifkin to leave Scotland. His kind of talent is needed here. But now where is he? Part of the political legacy, which went from 22 seats in 1979 to 1 seat today, Malcolm is exiled in Kensington. Then there's poor David. Member of a once great party, with every finger and toe absolutely crossed, hoping they'll get more than 1 seat at the next election in 2010. Some lady, some legacy.
Thank you very much. Can I just say I thought those were 4 absolutely fantastic contributions, very well judged, humorous and to the point. Now, we're looking for questions and or contributions, and we should have some roving microphones which should be about. Can we have the 2 microphones? Yeah, Kenny. Could you just raise your hand if you would like to make a contribution or ask a question?
Do you think it was a good idea that the women who had worked for the school dinner service for many years, providing an excellent service, paid quite well, with good conditions, do you think it was a good idea that they had to be left in limbo for many, many months while they wondered, would they still have their job?
The question I'd like to ask is, isn't it rather a strange judgment on a political reader that the net results of her many years in office was to produce precisely the opposite conclusions from the one she would like? First of all, as Jim Fillers reminded us, she destroyed the Tory party as an electoral force in Scotland, and poor Malcolm Rifkin, whom we regret to lose, had to go off to a constituency in the south of England. Secondly, she opposed any move towards Scottish control over Scottish affairs. She opposed devolution. She was utterly opposed to independence and all the rest of it. Nevertheless, she had precisely the opposite effect on that.
Now, the mine workers have been mentioned more than once, and as a Conservative leader in Edinburgh, I was proud to work with the Monkton Hall Mine Workers Consortium when, with a Conservative government in Westminster, we managed to reopen the pit. And for 4 years, that was an extremely successful enterprise with apprenticeships. All the coal was sold. And that was, as Jackie Aitchison, their leader, said to me, I was a communist. I now want to be a capitalist. And I would suggest that that's one of the positive legacies that Margaret Thatcher left to Scotland, invoked a spirit of, yes, individualism, but also of aspiration. And that's just one tiny example. And I don't have any questions.
Malcolm, maybe perhaps two issues here. There was the issue of what was happening in local government a lot, which of course was market testing of services and competitive tendering, I think, which lies the thrust of that. And Paul Scott's general point that despite the fact all these policies, I assume, were aimed at getting more votes, they had completely the opposite effect.
On the local government question, yes, it began with Margaret Thatcher, but it continued with Tony Blair and with Gordon Brown. All governments, regardless of their political colour, have found it necessary to ensure that you get best value for money, and therefore tendering has become relevant not just in local government but in so many other areas. Can I deal with what Paul Scott said? 2 points. First of all, you referred to the obvious destruction of the Tory party in the House of Commons. Worth remembering, that didn't happen after Margaret Thatcher went. The first election after Margaret Thatcher had gone was in 1992. We actually held every seat and won Aberdeen, and actually increased our representation. The disaster happened in 1997, and it didn't just happen in Scotland, it happened in Wales and it happened in the north of England as well. So you had a huge decimation for reasons which were not peculiar to Scotland and which happened some years after Thatcher had gone. Secondly, you make the historically correct point that Thatcher's policies on devolution and on Scottish issues perhaps helped the move towards a Scottish Parliament. Strange things happen. She didn't expect that to happen. She didn't want it to happen. I don't suppose that either Tony Blair or Gordon Brown, when they set up the Scottish Parliament, wanted Alex Salmond to become First Minister and the SNP to become the government of Scotland. So, you know, that's life. It's not a particular reason for deploring Thatcher any more than it would be a particular reason for deploring her successors.
Brian.
On local government, I mean, I think what everyone has to acknowledge is that Thatcher did change values and did move the goalposts in political debate. Whether that's a good thing or not is another question. And from my standpoint, then local government is essential in order to give support to people who need the services which can only be provided collectively. And if you reduce that, if you through, whether it's by competitive tendering, by cuts, by whatever it is, then the people who suffer from that are the people at the lower end of the social pile. And what we see today in Scotland is an acceptance of that philosophy. Every time people talk about free, which I mean Hollywood is obsessed with free things, you know, but every one of these is a middle class subsidy, which is taking away from people because the people who need them most were getting them already. So there's less to spend on in any sort of redistributionist policies. The same with freezing council tax. It's not poor people who benefit from freezing council tax. It's people who pay the most and would pay more. So actually the philosophy of Thatcherism, which is to give to the middle classes at the expense of the people whose need is most, has actually been embraced, and has been embraced here in Scotland. No wonder the Tories vote with the Nationalists for their budget, because essentially it is a budget, it is a philosophy which has embraced the redistribution of wealth away from those who have least towards those who have more.
Right at the back, and there's another hand up, I think, in the grey hair,
29 million days lost to industrial action in the United Kingdom. Can I ask the two socialists to your right what they would have done had they won the election in 1979?
Thank you very much. And then further on up, just over here. Geoffrey MacDonald, okay.
Wouldn't the panel agree with me that it was a big decision by the Conservative Party and eventually the United Kingdom to have a woman both as leader and Prime Minister in such a male-dominated, politics being such male-dominated?
Okay, maybe we'll start this time with Brian, particularly on Mary Scanlon's point about the number of days that were lost through strikes in the 1970s. Had Labour won the 79 election, what would they have done?
change comes in any society, and balances of power change within any society. And no matter who had won, whether if Labour had won the next general election, then the impact of the years, the latter part of the decade, would have had an impact on Labour policies, and Labour would ultimately have had to modernise. But I don't believe in any party's permanent right to govern. And the issue actually wasn't whether Labour won the issue tonight isn't whether Labour won the election. The issue is what happened afterwards and how these undoubted challenges and needs for change were addressed.
I used to be number 3 at the Scottish TUC before I entered Parliament. And if you really want to understand what happened to the trade union movement right up to the winter of discontent, you've got to go back quite a way to the Royal Commission on Trade Unions, whose report was widely welcomed. Now, I was on the Scottish TUC. We were well to the left of centre, and we actually had a number of communists on the General Council. And we went off, very unusual for us, but we went off for a weekend, the whole General Council and the officials, to study this huge report on the reform of the trade unions. And even the Communist Party members accepted that we had to change. Then we got Barbara Castle's In Place of Strife, which in a sense started to blame the trade unionists for the economic failures of the Wilson government. And those who can cast their mind back, my age in this audience, may remember the television programme where someone took Barbara Castle right through In Place of Strife and the prison gates were banging on a trade unionist. So there was a lot of bitterness against the Labour Party, a lot of bitterness against the system in the trade union movement. Then it had imposed upon it a wages policy against the manifesto promise of the Labour government of those years, and the bitterness grew. So you have to understand part of the reason for that winter of discontent and those strikes.
Malcolm, let's go back to Fiona Killen's question that if she was so good, why she was dumped, because presumably you and your other cabinet colleagues, the evening before the resignation came, had concluded at that point that she was doing more harm than good.
Yeah, it's not such a paradox or a contradiction as is being implied. What is remarkable in Margaret Thatcher's case is that really for the first 10 years of her prime ministership, the verdict was overwhelmingly favourable. But as so often happens with people who have that degree of power, they become less and less willing to hear other points of view, and their judgment becomes less impressive. And her colleagues concluded, I have no doubt it was the right thing to do, that she had made a marvellous contribution as Prime Minister. She was not going to go voluntarily, and therefore that decision had to be taken. Now, I was also asked, or we were asked, how we'd come to choose this woman in the first place. A male-orientated party, as the Conservative Party clearly was. And I can only tell you my own personal experience. I entered the House of Commons for the first time in '74. I knew very little about Margaret Thatcher, and I watched her in the House of Commons. And when Ted Heath resigned after the first ballot, and I had to choose between her, or Willie Whitelaw, or Jim Pryor, or Geoffrey Howe, politically I was probably closer to Willie Whitelaw or Geoffrey Howe, but I prefer winning elections to losing them. And she overwhelmingly came across as someone with the personal qualities to be a winner.
Well, I think Malcolm's right. We got rid of Margaret Thatcher, or at least I don't have blood in my hands, whatever he may have. Sorry, Malcolm.
No one's perfect.
I think the frank truth of that is that she had served her purpose, that the judgment was made that the Tory party would stand a better chance of winning the general election in 1992 with a new Prime Minister and a new leader than with Margaret Thatcher, and that judgment was proved absolutely spot on correct. So, in a sense, if you judge this from a party point of view, then the correct judgment was made and the change made at that particular time. And as Malcolm points out, I suspect the same judgment is presently being made within the Labour Party as regards Mr Brown, and that is part and parcel of politics and always will be. I think it was a tremendous, momentous change having a woman as leader of the Tory party, but she was picked not because she was a woman, but she was changed because she marked a fundamentally different type of leader with a different philosophy from that had applied in the past.
Okay, let's take some more contributions. I think, is that Jimmy Day? It is Jimmy Day. And, yeah, Jim.
Thank you. Jim Eadie, freelance consultant. Quite apart from the critique that we've heard this evening from the left, I'm interested to know, isn't it the case that Thatcherism on its own terms was an unmitigated failure? And two reasons here. Firstly, the abandonment of monetarism, the failure and then subsequent abandonment of the headline monetary target, sterling M3, and the huge human cost that created across society. And secondly, the levels of public spending were as high at the end of the Conservative period of government as they had been when Mrs Thatcher assumed power in 1979. So, judged by these two fundamental tenets of Thatcherism, monetary policy, the money supply, and public spending, Thatcherism wasn't as successful in terms of action delivered compared to the rhetoric at the time.
It's tonight about the influence Margaret Thatcher had in Scotland, but what about Scotland had influence on Margaret Thatcher? Did she go through the Adam Smith Institution and with her theories, with his theories and policies? So obviously Scotland had a lot of influence on Margaret herself.
Okay, maybe Malcolm, probably we'll get some response to that, mainly that Thatcherism was born in Scotland with Adam Smith, but in terms of the way in which she defined it, she failed because public expenditure continued to grow and monetarism was abandoned.
Well, there you are. You see, the poor woman can't win. You see, one half of the argument is that she slashed public expenditure, all the social services were destroyed under her leadership. Now we're being reminded, which is actually historically correct, that public expenditure actually continued to increase, probably more slowly than it would have done otherwise. But, you know, the Barnett formula, which has become this great totem showing how Scotland does so much better than England in public expenditure. And I was Secretary of State, George Younger before me. We actually administered the Barnett formula.
Margaret Thatcher was an ideologue, but she was also a politician who had to win elections. So Jim Eadie's quite right. But if measured by, you know, the strictest monetarist terms, she didn't adhere to the Holy Grail all the time. But remember that there were recessions under the government of Margaret Thatcher. And of course the money supply quite often got out of kilter.
Yeah, I personally think that there's been two problems with Thatcherism. The first was that they treated Scotland like a colony, which perhaps wasn't the greatest idea, and was perhaps given risen to the movement for self-determination, which has originated in devolution and which will end in independence. And the second one is the fact Norman Lamont said that unemployment was a price that was well worth paying. Now that shows a lack of humanity, which must surely be a problem for a political party that wants to gain votes. And this lack of humanity is the reason why Toryism is so unpopular, deservedly, in Scotland, and that is Margaret Thatcher's legacy.
If I could just have your name, sir?
Joe Middleton.
Joe, and I think that's Dennis Sullivan at the back. Dennis?
It is indeed. I wonder if Malcolm and David, who have been celebrating the sale of council houses, and therefore everybody who bought the council house no doubt believes that Mrs Thatcher was better than worse for Scotland. But today, 30,000 people find themselves looking for a house. I wonder how those people tonight feel about Mrs Thatcher.
Well, firstly, I don't think Scotland was treated as a colony at all. Scotland remains a thriving democracy, and if anybody that wanted Scotland to be independent, there had plenty opportunities at election to vote for a party committed to that, and they chose not to do so. As far as Dennis Sullivan's point, and Margaret referred to this in relation to council houses, could I remind people that the 400,000 council houses that have been sold have not been towed into the North Sea and destroyed. They actually continue to be the homes of ordinary working people in this country. Indeed, homes much improved by the several billions of pounds of their own money that they spent on their improvement, which would otherwise have fallen on the housing accounts of local authorities.
I don't believe that Scotland was treated as a colony. It was a very good debating point for the SNP to employ, there's no question about that. But I think the fact was that a gulf between Scotland and south of the border has been opening up politically for a long, long time, for some of the reasons I tried to adduce in my opening statement. And I think the great problem was, and interestingly, Neil Kinnock and Tony Blair were the same. Margaret Thatcher, Neil Kinnock and Tony Blair were never comfortable up here. In fact, Kinnock really didn't like to come at all. And I think they really had great difficulty getting a grip on what these Scottish people really thought and what they were all about, rather than simply saying, look, let's treat them like a colony. I mean, I used to call Malcolm the Governor-General. It was a good debating point, but I really didn't think he was the Governor-General. On council housing, even people who were buying on a big discount were very uncomfortable. And the interesting thing is that lots and lots and lots of them who actually bought on a discount didn't vote for the lady who made it possible for them to buy for a discount.
Thank you very much. Jim, I'm going to ask Sir Malcolm to sum up on behalf of the motion that Margaret Thatcher did more good than harm. Sorry.
I have to first begin by thanking Jim Sillars for his most thoughtful commiseration with me in the awful fate that I have experienced in resigning myself to being Member of Parliament for Kensington and Chelsea. It's an extraordinary punishment. It's an unusual constituency. I think it was remarked that every other Member of Parliament on a Friday leaves London and goes to the country. In Malcolm Rifkin's case, all his constituents leave London and go to the country. The only real punishment I've experienced is that I and about a dozen of my London colleagues have been unable to claim second homes allowances. So it clearly is a punishment I've thoroughly deserved. Now, Margaret Thatcher is someone I worked with very closely for a good period of time, and I entirely acknowledge that she was highly unpopular. Why was she unpopular in Scotland? For three reasons. First of all, she was a woman. Secondly, she was an English woman. And thirdly, she was a bossy English woman. And I recall indeed her coming into one cabinet committee and saying, well, I don't have much time today, only enough time to explode and have my way. So that's the kind of person she was. We knew exactly what we were getting. But you know, this debate has been very variable. And I found one of the most saddest aspects of the case that's been put against us was from Jim, from Margot, from one or two other people, and it's not, I think, irrelevant that this debate has spent quite a lot of time on council housing and on the right to buy your council house. Because what we have heard this evening again is this extraordinary paternalism from a whole section of left-wing middle-class opinion in Scotland, most of whom live in the homes that they themselves own, but have actually been willing to see continue indefinitely a situation where the vast majority of their fellow Scots of working class background would have been unable to aspire to home ownership. And let me just remind them that in 1974, 34% of Scots owned their own homes. The figure was 40% in communist Hungary and in Czechoslovakia. And in the rest of the United Kingdom, even far greater than that. So 400,000, as David McCletchie's Scots made their own judgment, and they are living in houses, and they are having a better quality of life as a consequence, and that is something that would have been denied to them but for Margaret Thatcher. The second point I make is that Brian Wilson very kindly, essentially, conceded much of the argument that we are making. Because he was very honest, unlike Jim, who built a different argument. Jim said there are separate Scottish values, however good Thatcher was for England, she was not good for Scotland. Brian, and I noted his words, he said, all I have said about Scotland apply to England and Wales as well. And that is crucial to this issue this evening. Because what effect he is saying is Margaret Thatcher was a bad Prime Minister, not just for Scotland, but for the United Kingdom. She was a failure. She should go down in history as someone whose net effect was damaging. Now, there are people who will believe that, no doubt believe it passionately. But it's not the judgment of the vast majority of this kingdom, north or south of the border, and it's not the judgment of the world as a whole, as we all well know. When Winston Churchill was 80 years of age, a young photographer came to take his photograph, and when he took that photograph, he said, you know, Sir Winston, this has been an enormous honour for me to take your photograph on your 80th birthday. I hope I'll have the privilege of taking your photograph on your 90th birthday and your 100th birthday as well. And Churchill apparently looked at him and said, "Don't see why not. You look reasonably healthy to me." Margaret Thatcher was not perfect. She was far from perfect. She had huge flaws, I've no doubt about it. Indeed, I know from my own experience I still have some of the scars on me to prove it. So I don't have any illusions about the downside. But I think the net effect, that's what we're being asked to decide, whether she did more good or harm. That is entirely on the positive side. And the very fact that 30 years later we're here debating this issue, I wonder if in 2039 we'll have a similar group of people here to debate whether Gordon Brown did more good or harm in Scotland during his prime ministership. I leave that painful thought with you, and I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Thank you.
I'll call on Brian Wilson to sum up.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I can only apologise to Malcolm Rifkind that tonight he's had to debate with the middle classes, but sometimes even the Tory MP for Kensington and Chelsea has to slum it. I just want to share one little anecdote of my own, one of my relatively few direct experiences of Mrs. Thatcher. And I represented at the 10th anniversary of the liberation of Kuwait, I represented the British government of the day, safe in the knowledge that nobody was remotely interested in the British government of the day. This was about Bush, old Bush and Thatcher and Powell and all these guys, you know, what I used to call the VIP branch of Saga Holidays. And so I was on the plane at Heathrow about to take off, and Margaret Thatcher was in the same plane. I thought, I'll wait till I'm up in the air before I speak to her. And she came over, and before I could actually come over and introduced her, said, "Mr. Wilson, I think we're going to the same place." She said, "We are." In milliseconds, within about 30 seconds, she says, "We've got to stand by them, the Kuwaitis." I said, "Absolutely, couldn't agree more. We should have finished the job." Couldn't agree more. Never saw the point of starting it myself if we weren't going to finish it. So we're getting on famously. And then she says, "But of course I was gone by then." and it went on like this all week. And of course, John Major flew into this event from Texas with Bush, and I think it was probably the depth of their personal relationship, with a little help from myself. And it came to a planting ceremony. They were both supposed to plant, a ceremonial spade to plant a tree in the garden of the British ambassador's residence. And so Major did his spadeful, Thatcher did hers, Major did his, Thatcher did hers, and the pair of it went at it like dervishes, that neither of them was going to stop. So I think whatever disagreement there is in the platform today, that, you know, but if you compare it with the Thatcher Major epilogue, then we've all got on very, very well. To me, the worst aspect of Thatcherism was maybe something that hasn't been mentioned tonight, and maybe this is something where, I don't know if Jim would agree with this, but it fed stereotypes, and there were stereotypes which ultimately were very damaging to Scotland, because Thatcher became English, and the Tories became English. And the Tories aren't English. The Tories are Scottish, they're Welsh, they're everywhere. But ultimately the beneficiaries of the polarisation that took place in Scotland during the Thatcher years were the people who traded on exploiting the false images of what divided us. And to me, it was an unconscious legacy, it was an unintentional legacy, but it is the legacy. And I don't have any political love of the Tories, but I have even less political love of the idea that throughout this period, that a legitimate strand of political opinion within Scotland was demonised, not for its values, not for its politics, not in open debate like this, but because somehow, because of Thatcher, it could be characterised as English, which it never was, because it was as much part of Scotland as my set of values and my beliefs are part of Scotland. And I think that has been a bad legacy for Scotland, because I think it has fed a lot of the politics and a lot of the false divisions in Scottish politics which exist today. Politics should be about the division of ideas. Politics should be the challenge of competing philosophies. It should not be about nationality. It should not be about accent. It should not be about trying to create divisions between people on the basis that they are something that you are not. So 30 years on, and this is where if I go back to what Malcolm said, where I said, and I think one of the features of this debate has been that it hasn't been so much about Scotland. It hasn't been, because it no longer matters about political convenience to try to portray Thatcherism as being an anti-Scottish force. That is kind of history now. So everyone would really agree to the arguments that we've been adducing tonight apply to the whole of the United Kingdom, but particularly to those parts of the United Kingdom which share the same economic and social features as much of Scotland. So that's not the division that matters. The division that matters, and when I say Thatcherism was bad for the UK or bad for Scotland, it's not the division between Scotland and England. It's not division between Scotland and the rest of the UK. It's the division between the 40% and the 60%. It's the division between the 20% underclass who were disowned by Thatcherism, who were damaged by Thatcherism, and from which we've never recovered, and which many parts of Scotland and the UK will not recover in many decades to come. It's about the people in the communities that you can go round here and see which were devastated during the 1980s and have never recovered from that devastation. That is a division that matters, not between Scotland and England, not between the false dichotomies of politics, but the have-nots and the haves, and the fact that Thatcher traded ruthlessly upon that division because she always knew that she only had to appeal to a minority who were the haves and did not have to worry about the have-nots. That is a legacy that we have lived with for a very long time, and which I believe that even with historical kindness to bring to bear, we should condemn the memory of Thatcherism rather than any way revise it in the way that might be done tonight. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we weren't planning to have a vote, but in the best traditions of question time, I think we should perhaps have a show of hands. We've had a dozen contributions from the floor, and they've been greatly appreciated. I have to say that I think we've had a terrific debate tonight. We've had contributions from the very top drawer, from the very top politicians. And it always helps when it's been characterised by good humour as well. So the motion which Sir Malcolm Rifkind moved, Margaret Thatcher did more good than harm in Scotland. If you agree with that, could you raise your hand? If you disagree with that, could you raise your hand? Oh dear. Carried. Carried. What do you think? I think it's carried. The motion is carried. A debate polarised and well argued, as you would expect from such a lineup of speakers. Predictably, though, no consensus. How do you begin to sum up such a controversial figure? To a large extent, Margaret Thatcher offended, not because of what she did, but because of perceptions about what she was planning to do. Yes, her policy on traditional industries drove a stake through the heart of many communities, but she got little credit for the growth in non-traditional industries. On the Constitution and the poll tax, she was presented as resolutely anti-Scottish, and yet she did nothing to tinker with the funding formula that brought more resources to the rebellious Scots. The sale of council houses was warmly embraced. It didn't dent, however, municipal socialism or wean tenants from the politics of the left. To her supporters, she told hard truths and pursued policies in a principled and resolute fashion. To many, she changed the country for the better. And yet, out with industrial policy, she wasn't really much of a Thatcherite at all. Welfare dependency grew and the public sector remained dominant. Our current politics have been defined by two people, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. No longer does the left argue for state subsidy for ailing enterprises. The political right dare not roll out the market in some key public services. Now, the closeness of the Labour and Tory positions in the 50s was